Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. For this week's episode, I interviewed the guy behind a thriving news site that covers the data center industry. If you had to make a list of technologies that are most important to the average person's day-to-day life, data centers would sit near the top of that list, and yet chances are you know very little about them. There are a few reasons for this. For one, they're not sexy in the way that an iPhone or a cutting-edge drone is sexy, but also the people and companies who run data centers are fairly secretive, mostly to protect their machines from any sort of attack. This combination of secrecy and obscurity has made Rich Miller's expertise very lucrative. He spent the last 2 decades covering data center tech for various news outlets he's owned. His current site, Data Center Knowledge, is a must-read for anyone working in the $60 billion industry. I interviewed Rich about how he accidentally fell into the beat, why he sold his first data center site, and what made him want to start a brand new one from scratch. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about my Substack newsletter. It's subscribed to by thousands of people across journalism, media, advertising, marketing, and public relations. Name a media company, large or small, and chances are it has at least a few employees who read my newsletter. If you're not subscribed, you're missing out on the daily insights that will make you better at your job. To subscribe, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the word Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, on to my interview with Rich. Hey, Rich, thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
So you've carved out a very lucrative niche for yourself in cloud computing, but you didn't actually start out as a technology reporter, right? Like you started in journalism, but it wasn't really covering a technology beat.
No, I started out as a sports reporter, covering initially high school and college events, and I worked at sports for the first few years of my career in newspapers. And then one point, my wife asked whether it would always be nights and weekends. I looked around the newsroom, and the primary day jobs were in business. So that's kind of how I migrated over to being interested in business journalism. And my first day working on the business desk was the stock market crash of 1987. So it was
yeah.
an
So
interesting introduction.
So you were working in print newspapers during a pretty decent time for the industry when they, especially compared to now.
Well, I mean, now's pretty busy too, but it was a really interesting time to be in print journalism. I worked at weekly and daily newspapers in New Jersey, and man, newsrooms were really fun and interesting places in those days. And I wouldn't trade that experience for anything. Worked at a couple of different places. In addition to working business, I did some specialty beats, which a lot of newspapers were experimenting with at the time. I did religion and values for a couple of years. I led special projects and did investigative stuff for a while. So I got to see a lot of the newsroom.
But you were working, like when you were covering business, you were covering it at the national level?
Mostly local and state level. So what we would do is we'd take sort of national issues in technology that people were thinking about, hearing about. We try to look for local angles to explain the trend to our readers. And after a while, I also had a technology column for a couple of years where I would just take something that was in the news, explain to readers why it mattered to them and where things might go from there. That was at a time when business coverage was very much becoming technology coverage as the internet really began to become a major force in business and obviously in publishing as well.
Yeah, now the two are inseparable. Like every business is in some ways a technology company today, but back then they were kind of separate beats.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I was just starting to cover some of the technology in here in central New Jersey, which in a lot of ways meant, biotechnology and things like that. But one of the first sort of driving location companies was based here. And I remembered very early on doing a lot of coverage of cell phones and people using them in cars and whether you'd get lost trying to follow a computer's direction. So it's pretty interesting because my kids, just rely on nothing but their smartphone directions.
And then you got more of an intimate connection to technology when you started. You started what, like a side hustle or side business building web pages?
Yeah, so the almost from the beginning of my experience with the internet, my wife got me online, and it was America Online, which was how most people were experiencing the internet then. And I figured out in one of my first sessions that you could create pages and upload them through AOL. And it was like a light bulb went off over my head that this is a publishing medium that takes all of the cost out of the equation. You don't need a printing press. You don't need, 100 trucks to deliver the news. That it really sort of, you know, you know, made a direct channel to be able to broadcast to the world. And I was really intrigued by that. And so we started learning how to build web pages. And my wife and I both learned HTML from free courses on the internet, and started a small local web hosting and web design company where we helped, primarily nonprofits try to adapt to how to use the internet. Because at the time it was kind of a business thing and kind of expensive, and we were involved in a number of local nonprofits, and so that became an interesting experience to understand how to build and deploy websites, which came in handy later on.
And was this like a side project? Like, were you still working your newspaper job?
I was working at a daily newspaper, and this was like a sort of a nights and weekend thing. Partly because it was fun. I really enjoyed websites, and we thought it was a pretty exciting time to be learning new technologies and just look at the way the world of communications was changing. And only then did it became pretty clear that the news business was going to have to reckon with the internet. And my idea was, well, I can help my employer make this transition and build out a lot of websites. But, that wasn't really the way it worked out. I was working at the Trenton Times at that time, and they, really sort of relied on a infrastructure that the Star Ledger had put together. So, it didn't necessarily translate neatly for the folks at in the broader news industry at the time as to how the internet was going to make a difference and how we might approach publishing there.
And this was in the 90s, right?
This is the late 90s, sort of 98 to early 2000. And so I began to get a little bit frustrated and was started looking at what it would be like to publish online, and the notion of working in a small publishing outfit or even as a solo publisher, which for the first time looked like something that might actually be feasible one day.
And but they did have a website, or they were already using a framework, or
they were using a framework built by other newspapers within the chain, and that was like, it was a Jersey wide that the folks that I worked for had a handful of newspapers in New Jersey, and they all worked from one news site and platform. Which it seemed to me was missing the opportunity to really, be a local newspaper. And obviously many hyperlocal sites have since picked up on the importance of being able to bring online coverage to the local level, because I think from the get-go it was something that the larger organizations and sort of state and regional news sites struggled to sort out.
So how did you start building a specific interest in cloud technology?
It really happened through my wife, who was, she works in the communications and journalism, and then with her web skills, she was working to build a web platform for a local real estate company, and met a guy who deployed real estate for technology companies, and specifically for folks who were building internet service providers.
So when you say real estate, you mean he was selling real estate to companies so they could build on top of the real estate, or do you mean cloud server real estate?
So what it was then was folks like America Online, as a good example, were looking for local nodes where they could place the equipment where people could connect to the internet. And So when your modem made all that noise and dialed in, that was the initial demand, was for sites where they could have the equipment that could answer those calls and connect you to the larger network. And that required real estate. And it was something I really, I understood the way that the internet worked, and in designing and hosting websites, I kind of got that piece of it. But I met this guy who said, listen, there's this whole other world out there that supports all of this. And in the early 2000, I guess, he said, look, just go with me, take a look at one of these data centers and tell me what you think. And I walked into this small facility near Princeton, and it was filled with rows of cabinets filled with servers and blinking lights, and it was cold because they wanted to keep the machines from overheating, and there were network cabling all over the place. And it was just this amazing world that you have no idea exists when you're just sitting at your desk looking at your web browser. But it immediately occurred to me as I looked at this that we're going to need these everywhere, because the internet was growing like crazy, and infrastructure, it seemed to me, was going to become a big part of the story.
And at the time, not a lot of outlets were covering cloud technology, right? Because it's sort of a secretive industry.
It very much was at the time, because people thought data centers should be secret, that nobody should know where it is, because it's a big data security issue. A lot of the ones who built big data centers at the time were financial outfits, and they thought security through obscurity. Nobody should know about this. And so in terms of the information around it was really all bottled up in newsletters and paid services and that kind of thing. And so we kind of changed all that, and I worked to start a news site that covered the industry. The working terminology then was carrier hotels. So carrierhotels.com was our big site, because there were these buildings that sprung up in major cities, like downtowns of cities. They'd be right next to the phone company building, so they could make short connection runways and not have to pay a lot of fees for that. And because at the time, when they supposedly deregulated telecom, they said, okay, you can compete with the bell companies, but you got to put your equipment in their buildings. And after a while, folks figured out that letting your competitor look after your equipment wasn't a formula for success. So they just looked like for the nearest buildings in town and started packing it with telecom equipment. So that's kind of how we got a start, and just started writing news stories about the fact that these buildings existed, what went on inside of them, and how all of this was sort of working together to provide this whole new frontier for the economy.
And what was the business relationship with this real estate guy?
So he had a business that did leasing and site selection for companies that would locate this, and I did a news site that would bring in eyeballs, really, people who were interested in the business and wanted to know about these facilities. And I'd refer folks over to him, and then he could. Some of them might want to work with him on finding and locating sites. So that was the original business model.
So it was an early version of web content marketing, basically.
Pretty much, yeah, with leading with news and using that to build an audience that would be interested in services.
And was he just kind of paying you a salary, or how did that work?
Yeah, initially that's how we set it up. Well, it was a small business, about 4 or 5 people at the time. And I handled the whole publishing. And since I could, build and host websites, kind of did learn the soup to nuts business of operating a .com during the middle of the telecom bust.
And so you eventually, though, left and ended up launching your own site about data centers. How did that come about, and what was the site?
Sure. So the business became a little bit more difficult when the sort of whole .com boom came to an end, and a lot of companies had built huge data centers, figuring that they were going to be filled with all these startups that were going public and had all this money. That didn't work out, and my partner had wanted to focus on the real estate side of things and dealing with some of the challenges over there. So the website, really couldn't afford me anymore. So I started freelancing again and looking at different sort of business models and exploring what it would be like to try and continue this as a freelancer. I worked with an outfit in the UK that wrote all about the web hosting industry, just kind of writing stories for them. But after about a year or so, I noticed that there were suddenly all these data center transactions taking place, including some facilities that I know people had difficulty marketing that were suddenly selling for a lot of money. And it seemed to me that something had changed out there and that this business was picking up. So as you could do at the time, I just sat down at my laptop and fired up a blog using, it might have been movable type at the time, and started publishing stories about the data center industry.
And what was the site called?
It was called Data Center Knowledge, and that wound up becoming the largest site covering the data center industry. It grew pretty rapidly as companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon started building the cloud, and hosting everybody else's data required very large data centers. And so there was a lot of growth in the data center industry. All of a sudden, it went from this quiet thing that nobody knew about to gaining visibility. When popular websites down, people were like, "Oh, something's broken in the data center," and that's what the problem is. So suddenly, people began to understand the existence and importance of this infrastructure. And so over the next 5 years or so, it grew pretty quickly. And from the business perspective, the thing that came along and really made a difference was Google launching its AdSense program, where you could just take a snippet of code and put it on your website, and they'd sell and display text ads mostly. But that came along right at a time where it helped me monetize the early days of that business and kind of bootstrap the whole thing.
Were you seeing most of your traffic coming in through Google, just people like researching the industry?
Yeah, because we were one of the first publications covering the data center industry. So because we were putting out a lot of content that all had data center search terms in it, when people went to Google and tried to learn about this industry, they often wound up at Data Center Knowledge. So just the sort of organic search traffic was our largest source of audience generation. A lot of people found us that way.
And because Google AdSense is contextualized, someone looking to buy something in the data center space, whether it's hosting or something like that, they would land on one of your articles, see a contextualized ad, kind of giving them what they were looking for, click on that, and then you would get a cut of that money.
Exactly. Google indexed each of the articles. They develop an idea what it was about, and they would match the ads to that and display ads that were about co-location services, if that's what the story was about. And people who were searching for that would wind up on the story, click the ad, and then Google would get paid. And once a month, they would send me a check. It was an important transition because I had a lot of different kind of skills that applied to this, but I was not an ad salesman. And so that was a real way to grow the financial side of the business and make it viable.
And you eventually made it even more of a scalable business, right? Like you joined an ad network?
Yeah. So I was, as Data Center Knowledge was beginning to grow, I was contacted by a guy who worked for IDG, which was one of the big tech publishing networks that did, the company-specific and industry-specific business trade publications. And they were looking for blogs to include in a new advertising network where they aggregate a bunch of blogs, go to larger advertisers and sell ads that would appear across this niche of sites that were in, related verticals. And the guy I met and was working with, Kevin Normando, wound up becoming my business partner. And and we worked together at Data Center Knowledge, and we are working together again at my newest publication, which is called Data Center Frontier. And Kevin really understood selling online content. He'd worked at AOL and was, enjoying doing the same thing at IDG. But then they kind of shifted the blog network more over towards consumer stuff and gadget blogs. And Kevin was like, I really think this is an interesting niche. And he got in touch and said, hey, let's work together. And my response to that was like, I think we both spent a lot of time building brands for other folks. Let's, get together and do it for ourselves.
So with the AdSense, that was more kind of direct to consumer demand type stuff, people actually going to purchase. You got this guy who's experienced at selling ads in the tech space. So he was able to start, once he partnered up with you, start directing, like selling like brand advertising, display advertising to some of these big data companies, these big cloud companies.
Well, the initial audience was for the advertising was the service providers who were operating data centers and were looking for customers, and many of them had fairly limited experience, buying ads and working digitally. And so Kevin helped introduce a lot of people to a lot of our clients to how to work with online advertising and to understand the specifics of the data center industry and what they were after, what they were trying to accomplish in their marketing and their outreach, and kind of put together packages, mostly of banner ads at the time, because that was sort of the coin of the realm. And we grew pretty quickly because we had a lot of audience coming to the site who were interested in data centers, because they would go to Google too, and you enter data centers and up pops our site. So Kevin had the insights to be able to help those people understand how to speak to our audience, and the ad business grew pretty quickly after that.
And did you feel like you could run circles around traditional media? Because I seem to remember all the way up until like 2010, like all the tech blogs were the ones that were just constantly breaking news and just, so far ahead of mainstream media. And then somewhere around the mid-aughts, that's when, the Wall Street Journals, the Bloombergs, the New York Times of the world started really kind of spending big money on hiring top tier technology journalists. And now I feel like they've kind of pulled ahead in terms of coverage. But I'm guessing at the time, like you just had an open field to cover this stuff.
There was a tremendous advantage in focus and specialization, particularly within technology, where there were so many different types of business going on. I mean, there was mobile phones, there was gaming, and we had a very focused and specific niche in the data center world that most of even the large tech sites didn't pay a lot of attention to, much less the national media.
Because they were consumer focused.
Yeah, and I think it was an interesting shift for me from having written, for a general audience where usually the journalist who's done a lot of research knows more about the topic than the person they're writing for. Whereas when you go to this sort of specialization, you realize that your audience is really well informed. It sort of raises your game in terms of the preparation you have to do, and the reporting and understanding of the topic is very different. But it's only very recently that suddenly the data center industry has become interesting to larger publications. I think it was about 2013 or 14. I saw a data center story in National Geographic, and that's when I knew that the landscape was changing.
And you eventually sold Data Center Knowledge. Why did you decide to sell it?
Well, one of the challenges you have when you're building a news organization like this is you have to think about how big you want to be and what your core competency is. And as in 2011, 2012, Data Center Knowledge started to gain some really substantial audience, and the question becomes: is what's the next phase? Is if it's being bigger, how do you do that? Do you want to build out a lot of staff? Or do you, want to look for someone to partner with, or perhaps an acquirer? And while Kevin and I were kind of thinking about this, we were approached by an outfit that ran a network of technology sites that were focused on things like web hosting that were adjacent to data centers, but they didn't have a data center publication, and they just bought a data center events company. And what you see in the technology business is lots of times events and news coverage go alongside one another, along with sort of lead generation operations. And they came to us and said, "Hey, we like what you guys do and think it'd be a good fit." And it worked out. It was an outfit called iNet, and they acquired data center knowledge, and we stayed with the publication for a couple of years, and it was a really successful transition.
But you eventually decided to leave. Why did you do that?
Well, there were two reasons. The first is that I was burnt out. I was burnt to a crisp. Yeah, the whole process. It had been about 8 years at that point that I had been running at full speed in terms of keeping up with the news demands of the industry, and it had been a lot of growth, and you just get a little bit exhausted and burnt out after a while. And about the same time, iNet was acquired by a larger company, an events outfit called Penton, and I kind of took a look, and they're really good at data products and events, but I didn't see a lot of necessarily the same kind of focus on journalism that we'd had at iNet. So I just saw that as an opportunity to step out and take a year or two to do some travel and get some rest and think about what comes next. I kind of figured I would wind up doing something else. Just didn't know at the time that it was gonna continue to be in the sort of cloud and data center space.
Right, because you experimented with a few other things first, right? Like Bitcoin or that kind of stuff, blockchain stuff.
Yeah, because I thought that was going to be a really important and interesting new journalistic opportunity. I don't know that the models kind of worked out as I had thought at first. There was a lot of, in the early days of Bitcoin journalism and publications, I think there was a lot of pay for play going on that was very direct. And then a venture-backed outfit came in and started a site called CoinDesk, which was putting a lot of resources into doing that. And it seemed like they really had a first mover advantage. And when I looked around at other opportunities, I kept coming back to data centers because there was so much going on. And the industry was changing in ways where I thought there were stories to write that I hadn't been able to get to tell in the way I wanted to when I was trying to cover the breaking news every day, which was really very much what data center knowledge was here's what's happening today and what you need to know if you're in this industry. So Data Center Frontier became an opportunity to try and tell the longer and bigger trend stories that worked with a lot of different sources to get a breadth of perspectives. Because over time, the data center industry has become complex to cover because there's so many elements of it. You need to understand the business drivers on the demand side that are using the data center space. You have to understand the buildings themselves and how they operate it, with power and cooling. The specifics of that are complicated. And then real estate business models and finance. And there's a lot to do there. And so I dived back in.
So what's like an example of something you would cover now that you wouldn't have covered at data center knowledge?
So we take a look at the demand for data centers in new and deeper ways. A lot of it is very geographic. For example, Northern Virginia is the data center capital of the world right now. It's where a large percentage of cloud computing infrastructure is located. And there are reasons for that, and to sort of understand what those reasons are and what that means, not just to the data center industry, and of course, what it means is a lot of business activity, but also what it means to the community and the region. There's been a lot of real estate speculation because so much land is needed to buy more and to build more data centers and create more capacity for these cloud platforms like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook are all very large players in the data center industry in areas like that. That's just sort of one way, is to dig in and look at what it means right to the community, from land values and real estate values right down to the design of the buildings. Because in one of the towns that had about 100 data centers, there were complaints from residents because they look like these big ugly warehouses. And this conversation got going about how do we make them look a little bit more attractive, particularly if we're going to see them driving along the local roads. And that wasn't the kind of detail and depth that was easy to get into when you're just trying to cover who's deploying what, where, and to whom.
And, when you launched Data Center Knowledge, you were such an early mover advantage. You got the benefit from Google. What's your kind of main focus now in terms of audience and audience building and distribution?
So we look a lot more at social media, and we work on building newsletters and email lists pretty good. Those have been more reliable audience builders, partly because it was a kind of an interesting process building a news website in 2015 after I'd previously done it in 2005. So we worked a lot more on visuals and having images that would translate on social media and generate interest in stories, and thinking about how we were presenting this. Because it used to be nobody wanted pictures of their data centers on the internet. But at the same time, they are incredibly visual facilities. When you walk through them, there's blinking lights, there's colored network cables. It's like a whole foreign environment in a different world to most people. So to be able to show that has always been an interesting and sort of undertold part of the story for me. And over the years, we worked with a lot of folks to tell them just that and say, hey, listen, we need images to go with our stories to help tell this story. And so that was a big part of being sort of leaning forward on the social and building our channels there. And in terms of social, one of the most important networks has been LinkedIn, which it turns out is where the data center crowd hangs out. That's their social network of choice. So we've worked pretty hard on Data Center Frontier in building audience through LinkedIn and sharing content there.
And is it just mainly through your page or groups, or where are they hanging out within LinkedIn?
So in my sort of personal LinkedIn feed, I share a lot of stories and have built up a pretty good audience there. And we also have a company page on LinkedIn. My wife, Colleen, helps manage that and shares our content over there because she has social media wizardry skills. And so that's really been how we focused on LinkedIn. We do use the groups to share some stories. There's a lot of very specific industry groups for different specializations within the data centers and cloud computing. But I'm also careful of that because, there's a lot of, there's sort of a group spam that goes on, and the signal to noise ratio is a little bit different there than on channels that you can control a little bit more tightly.
Yeah, I've ranted about this. At some point, every content marketer started, I think, advising all their clients or putting out articles saying, you need to use LinkedIn groups. Every time you publish a new article, go and post it to every single LinkedIn group. And I think they've just become spam factories as a result.
Yeah, I've got a couple that I focus on where we've gotten both good discussion and a good sort of reading and sharing the stories on there, but not all of them are. So you kind of learn which ones are productive and worth your time, and which ones are just, you get lost in the sauce.
And how has your monetization changed since your last business? Obviously, the advertising market is more sophisticated, more targeted. How are you approaching that?
So the difference between the data center knowledge and data center frontier is really that it used to be that the banner ad played a much larger role in people's marketing initiatives. Uh, with data center frontier, we have focused more on sponsored content and on lead generation programs because that's what the data center clients that we work with are most interested in. We wanted to very much have, people that don't like the term thought leadership now. I really do, because I think there's a lot of opportunities for companies in the industry to explain what they do and what they're seeing in a way that can be useful and can make sponsored content that has value to an audience, where it's not just, oh, look, here's a problem, we just happen to have the solution right here, which is the typical kind of marketing blog thing you see. So we work closely with my partner Kevin, particularly works closely with the partners on that. And then there is a whole lead gen operation where that we help market white papers for people. And we work with creating special reports on particular topics within the data center industry. Sustainability is a big one right now because there's a lot of focus on how people are using energy and the impact on the environment. Edge computing, which is distributing a technology closer to users, is a hot topic. So we'll do reports on those kind of topics, and typically we'll get an underwriter for the report, and then people they're freely available, but folks sign up and share their email address and information.
And that so the person who wants to report, they're probably involved in the industry, very highly likely to buy. In order to access the report, they have to put in some information like their email address,
right.
Name, probably industry title, and then in exchange, the report gets emailed to them probably as a PDF. And then you take that lead gen and you hand it over to the advertiser or the person who has purchased it so that they can use those as leads for future customers.
Right. And the reports all make clear that, who the sponsor is and that they can expect to hear from them. And but the thing about that is that just about all these folks are interested in these products. And so it's a useful interaction on most levels, and so that's really kind of how the lead gen operation works.
And do you keep those email addresses too for your own newsletter operations?
We do, and that's one of the ways we work on trying to build our newsletter audience. We have separate lists for folks who are interested in white papers, and another one that's built from the editorial website. We invite people to sign up. On social media, we'll invite people to get the editorial newsletter as well. And that's where we're 3 times a week now. And we'll share the headlines, and we might have an ad or two in the newsletter as well.
And the other part of your business, you said, is like a CEO of some kind of cloud technology vendor wants to opine about things within the industry and be considered a person who knows his stuff and build up his own personal brand and the brand of his company. So he pays you, he writes an article, 1,000 words, I'm guessing, and then pays you to publish it to the site as like SpawnCon.
Right. We have a separate section called Voices of the Industry, which is for folks from the industry who work with our advertising program, and we try to make that as valuable as possible to readers. Some companies do better than others, but that's very much the model. Yeah.
And you keep this pretty lean, right? It's like you and a couple freelancers.
Yeah, it's me, Kevin, my wife, Colleen. We've got a number of freelancers. Some support Kevin in working with his operations. And I have a few people that do freelance writing for us, mostly in terms of looking at specific areas like specialties. We have one who writes just about satellite communications and how they fit into the data center world right now. So that kind of thing.
And what are your long-term ambitions for the site? Because I feel like cloud technology is now being woven into the very fabric of our lives, and with the coming of big data and AI and 5G, like it's going to become even more integral to everything we do, from, the business side to entertainment to shopping to everything. So what does that mean for you, and what do you want to do, 5-10 years from now?
The 5-year question. Well, I mean, the mission critical role of data centers and cloud computing has been reinforced so dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic that it's really clear that this infrastructure is going to play a meaningful role in the economy, the whole digital society going forward. And I'm really interested in seeing where that goes and where that takes us. We're seeing more data centers in more places. I talked about edge computing. We're going to see data centers become a much more common part of the landscape, both in cities where it's difficult to build these kind of things, but also in the suburbs. One of the big trends we've seen is cloud data centers being located in suburbs and even in rural areas. So, we'll see things like data center districts popping up. And an important story, I think, to me, is how the data center industry continues to work to be a force for sustainability and renewable energy. The cloud computing platforms are some of the largest users of energy in the world, but as a result, they've also gained some focus from folks like Greenpeace and such, and have made the transition to becoming the largest buyers of renewable energy. Folks like Google and Facebook and Microsoft are among the largest purchasers of wind and solar energy, and have helped sort of create markets there. As an example, if somebody wants to build a large solar farm, Google may come along and say, hey, however much energy you're going to produce there, we'll buy all of it. And then that provides makes it easy for them to go and finance that project. But this is going to be a really big issue going forward, and there's ways where the data center industry can participate in the community in more meaningful ways. And in Europe, you see data centers where the heat that comes out of the servers is used to then in the heating and cooling systems of local communities, of local residences and offices. There's a test like that going on in Seattle with an Amazon facility that's right next to a data center. So there's lots of ways that the data centers are going to become not just the driving force in the digital economy, and more important, certainly as long as we're in pandemic mode here, but also going to become a bigger part of sort of everyday life and the landscape around us. There's a lot of stories about people getting crazy about 5G towers and things like that, but the antennas for wireless systems are going to be placed everywhere in urban landscapes, and how that happens and what that looks like and some of the issues coming up around that, I think, are really important. So I think there are a lot of stories left to tell, and some of them are going to be pretty interesting.
Okay, Rich. Well, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
We are at datacenterfrontier.com, and I'm on LinkedIn, and I am tech_journalism on Twitter.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's been a blast.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast, so if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.